Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Karl-Christian Johannessen. I'm a staff attorney here with the Township Association. Today, we'll be making sure how not to make the grave mistake. We'll be specifically discussing cemeteries here, and how towns can, well, specifically, the types of town cemetery or types of cemeteries are under Minnesota law, how a town can acquire a cemetery, and then managing your cemetery if you do in fact have one. So in general, there are two major categories of cemeteries under Minnesota law. First, you will have private cemeteries. These are cemeteries governed by Minnesota statutes chapter 307. These types of cemeteries are going to be heavily restricted as to who they have in that cemetery. So these aren't going to be applicable to townships because townships, generally speaking, need to be open to the public. Some things that might include private cemeteries are going to be churches, especially if they just restricted access to that cemetery to the members of that congregation, or familial cemeteries. Now, because of how heavily restricted these are, there aren't going to be a lot of private cemeteries here in Minnesota. And so that chapter actually has fewer things addressed than the Minnesota statutes chapter 306, which governs public cemeteries. Public cemeteries are going to be anything that isn't a private cemetery. So that will include township cemeteries. There are cemetery associations that exist that will run the cemeteries. These are organizations that have a board that run these cemeteries, and they'll be privately owned, but they're considered public cemeteries. So the distinction between private and public is not non-government versus government, rather it's who is buried there. And with that, you have a further breakdown of state-run or government-run versus non-state or privately run cemeteries. So when we look at a cemetery, we always want to ask the question, who owns it? Could there be a cemetery association there? Is it built on a farm? Is it a familial cemetery? Could it be a church cemetery? Was there an old congregation there? Has the building since been torn down, but the cemetery remains? Could it be the township's cemetery, either through direct creation by the township or acquisition through other means that we'll discuss a little bit later here? Is it maybe city-owned outside of city limits? In a few cases, it could also be owned by other government entities like the county, the DNR, veterans associations. For some period of time, it might just actually be owned by no one too. And again, we'll discuss further implications of these as we walk further through this presentation. Now, for towns, this will be the main questions I get when I talk about cemeteries, the acquisition. There are 3-4 major topics here that we like to look at. The first is, how do we create a cemetery if we want it? Next is, a cemetery association is asking us to either give their cemetery to them or for asking for us to take it over. There are issues of abandonment and neglect, and that is a question I most frequently get asked about when it comes to cemeteries. And then if we do have a cemetery or we don't want a cemetery, how do we limit acquiring that? So when we look at creating cemeteries and we look at cemeteries in general, towns apply their law under 2 different areas. So the first is going to be under chapter 306. That gives some guidance for townships as to how cemeteries are run, how some things might be created, how some transfers might occur. But when we look at creating, the creation portions of 306 do not apply to townships. They'll only apply to private associations. It may apply to counties or cities, but it does not apply to townships. This is because townships gain their power to create cemeteries under Chapter 365. More specifically, we'll be looking at statutes 365.26 through 365.36. But not all of that has to deal with creation. So if a town would like to create a cemetery, they must first receive voter approval to do so. And this is going to happen at the annual meeting. It's not going to be by a ballot question or at a public hearing, but like a lot of issues that occur at the annual meeting, it will be an issue that's delegated to the town board. In a lot of ways, I like to think of the voter mechanisms at the annual meeting working like an on or off switch that gives the board the power to then take an action or stop a board from taking an action. So here, what we're going to be looking at is towns have to receive voter approval to first create a cemetery, but then it's up to the board as to what to do next. So that's going to include acquiring the necessary real estate to build up that cemetery. That's going to include what kind of rules are going to be in that cemetery, which we'll get into a little later, what kind of rules you can have or what kind of rules are common. Who are you going to hire as employees, or who's going to manage the cemetery? Are you going to delegate it to a supervisor? What are we going to do with funds for that cemetery? As we'll learn a little bit later, there are some restrictions when it comes to cemetery funds, just like you would have restrictions when it comes to road funds. So all these questions are going to be handled by the township board and not by the voters. All the voters do is turn on or off that power to create that cemetery. Next, the board can have a cemetery transferred to them. Under 365.26, township boards can receive an already existing cemetery by resolution, so long as you have voter approval prior. Again, this is going to be an on-off switch, but this is going to be more immediate. You're going to want some indication that a cemetery association wants to transfer that cemetery to you. So again, this is going to be accepted by resolution and you'll need voter approval prior. Now, what if we look at it the other way? What if the town already has a cemetery, but they no longer want to maintain that? And an association or a group has come up and said, no, we'll take over that and we'll be the responsible party in this instance. And town, you can get rid of all of your obligations towards the cemetery. Well, towns are allowed to transfer a cemetery to an entity that is operating under Minnesota Statutes Chapter 306. The way the town can disseminate the cemetery is through either sale, you can sell it for some sum and receive that in return, or you can actually gift that cemetery. There may be no required to receive compensation in return, especially if you're looking at it from a public purpose perspective, that the town is not equipped to manage the cemetery, and this association is equipped and very willing to manage this cemetery. Now, the town will also need voter approval in selling or gifting away the cemetery as well. So if this issue of transference is going to come up, if the board is making considerations, if they're in communication with the cemetery association, be sure to prepare this around the time of your annual meeting, and then you can have the voters vote on that at that meeting. If the issue does come up before that point, you can always have a special town board or township meeting, and there are ways to bring that, there are 3 methods to bring a special town meeting, but usually it's going to be best to wait until that annual meeting to be able to bring up this issue. Now, like I said earlier, this is what I receive the most questions about regarding cemeteries. This is going to be abandoned cemeteries. What do we do when a cemetery is abandoned? And in some cases, do we actually acquire a cemetery when there's abandonment? Now, when we talk about abandoned cemeteries, there are actually 2 things that we're going to discuss. Those are cemeteries that are actually abandoned and those that are neglected. One of these actually transfers ownership duty onto the township. The other does not. And so it's very important that we clarify the 2 so that we know what kind of duties a township has when it comes to a cemetery that hasn't been maintained, where burials haven't occurred there for many years. So going reverse to that previous slide, we're going to actually start with neglect because this provides fewer duties for the township board. So a neglected cemetery is one that's still owned by an association or one that you really can't find evidence of dissolution of. A town board may maintain this cemetery if neglected for a period of 10 years. If you've looked at this cemetery, there haven't been any burials there, the cemetery hasn't been mowed, headstones haven't been cleaned, things like that, things haven't been weeded, the town board may come in and spend some funds to help maintain that cemetery. Now, this is not going to apply to private cemeteries, so you can't go into an old church cemetery necessarily if that was only available to those congregants. You can't go to a familial cemetery and start maintaining that. But if it was publicly owned, if there are a couple of families in the township who are buried at this cemetery, the town board can come in and they can start maintaining that cemetery. Now, this idea of a neglected cemetery generally is ill-defined. And so it comes to a matter of what do you think it is? For me, I think of it as this is a cemetery that hasn't been touched. So if you've seen it mowed, if you've seen it weeded, even though no new burials are happening, that's probably not a neglected cemetery. Now, at the same time, if it's not being mowed or weeded, but you have seen a couple of burials there, again, that's probably not going to be an abandoned cemetery for my purpose, or a neglected cemetery from my perspective. But if you know the association there and they're just not touching that, you can reach out to them and ask, okay, have you done any maintenance? Have you made any burials here over the last 10 years? And if not, the town board can dispense of some of their funds and work with that association and help maintain that cemetery, help bring that back to a nicer form so the families can come visit. With that being said, the other form of abandonment we're going to look at are actual abandoned cemeteries. So when we look at state law, there are actually 2 places where maintenance duties fall onto a government entity for an abandoned cemetery. Now, in both cases, I would like to think of this as a means of transference. Just like you would get a voter approval at the annual meeting to transfer a cemetery to you, in the same way, you can have a cemetery transferred to you if it has been abandoned. And this is just essentially by law transferred to you. There's no control you have over this. This is if an association either dissolves or in some cases may still exist. So going back to state law, these 2 types of abandonments. First is when an association actually does still exist. This is found in Chapter 306. Here, it indicates that the county may take ownership. Now, we like to look at counties, and frequently, I'm not aware of many counties that provide assistance when it comes to cemeteries. So you're probably not going to want to rely on this. Again, when's the last time you saw a county actually take over a cemetery. So if it's still existing and the cemetery is in some disrepair, and you're looking to at least help that out, you won't take ownership of that cemetery. But like we saw on the previous side, it can be neglected, if not maintained for 10 years or so. Then you can go in and again, help with maintenance there. Again, you wouldn't be the entity that would assist in burials, that would assist in any sort of deeds and transferences. You wouldn't be involved in that, but you could help maintain. Now, if a cemetery does, or if a cemetery association does not exist, Minnesota statutes 365.28 says that if a public burial ground has not been owned by a cemetery association for 10 years, the cemetery is transferred to the town. So in this case, before the town starts taking ownership duties, what you'll want to determine is if a cemetery association does exist. There are a couple of ways we can do this. We can look at filing records with the Secretary of State's office, see if there's a business entity still in play. Now, a lot of cemetery associations are not formed by a formal filing like that. And so you may also want to check and see if anybody has any record of who was there, who was maintaining that. And then if you are able to find anything, you can return to that person and see if they are still an entity that's looking to maintain the cemetery in some way. One other method you can look at is just like there's the Township Association, there's also a Cemetery Association from Minnesota. So you can reach out to that Cemetery Association saying, okay, we are Green Acre Township in White County. Do you know of any cemeteries that exist in this township? And so the Cemetery Association can look at their records and see, or the State Association of Cemeteries can look at their records, see if anybody has been an entity at that point, and then if they're still existing. And if they're unable to find anything and you can't find any evidence of disillusionment, let's go back to this neglected cemetery. If you can't find evidence of dissolution, it's better not to act as if that cemetery has been transferred to you. But if you can find evidence of that dissolution, then you can treat it as an abandoned cemetery and understand that this cemetery is going to be transferred to the township, and it's going to then be the township's role to ensure that that cemetery is maintained. Now, like I said, this is going to be the most common question I receive. And so what we want to look at is in this flow chart is, does the township actually have a cemetery? And so there are a couple of things you want to look at. First, did the town create a cemetery? If it did, the town has a cemetery. Congratulations. Now, you should already be aware of this, so this one is quite easy to look at and say, yeah, we do have a cemetery. Now, the first major point of delineation is, if you didn't create the cemetery, is it public or private? Who was buried there? Was it just a family? And is it on farmland? It's probably going to be a private cemetery. But if you know of a couple of families that were buried in this cemetery, and it might have been part of a church, but that church opened up its doors for folks from all across the state to come and be buried at their cemetery, then it's probably public. If that church is very secluded and only to members of its congregation, not even family members who are from outside of the congregation are buried there, just those who are part of the congregation, then it's probably a private cemetery. But again, if there are people there who are buried from part of the state, then it's probably going to be a public cemetery. So if it is a public cemetery, the next question you want to ask is this transferred to the town? As we discussed earlier, there are formal means of transference. You'll have voter approval. So you should have record of meeting minutes from your annual meeting. Then you should have meeting minutes from your board meeting saying that, yes, we accepted this transference, we accepted property, things like that. Even if it hasn't been maintained for a number of years, if you can go back and see, yep, the board actually did accept this transference, then it's going to be a township cemetery. But if it wasn't actively transferred to the town, then the next part is this going to be abandoned or is it going to be neglected? And really the first question here is, does a cemetery association still exist? If the answer is yes, a cemetery association exists, then it hasn't been abandoned. And so the answer there will be no. And so there will be no township cemetery. However, if the association has dissolved and the cemetery has been abandoned, meaning that there is no maintenance, there are no burials there for the last 10 years, then it is going to be a township cemetery. So if you ever have any questions, this handout will be available for download, just like these slides will be a little. And so you'll be able to use this handout and walk through it if you have a cemetery in question in your township. And you'll be able to see, all right, did we create it? No. Is it public? Probably. Did the town ever accept a transfer? No. Has it not been maintained for a period of 10 years? Yes. Now, is there evidence of an association dissolving? No, there's no evidence of an association dissolving. So therefore we have no township cemetery. Now, in that case, you can still maintain it, make sure it's beautified, but there's no duty to take over and actively manage that cemetery. Now, after walking through this slideshow, or after walking through that flow chart, you determine that you do in fact have a cemetery and you don't want it. That's a lot of maintenance responsibilities. That's going to cost the township money that the township frankly doesn't have to spend. People don't visit it anyway. So why take the active effort? The town doesn't want to worry about burials. What are you going to want to do? Well, first, we'll want to walk through that flow chart. We'll want to see, is it private? Does an association still exist? Those kinds of things. Is there any evidence that it would actively transfer to the town? Now, the other question is, could this maybe be someone else's duty to maintain this cemetery? In some cases where there are Native American burials, where there are veteran burials, that might be a state entity like the Historical Society or the Veterans Association or the DNR. It might be their duty to actually maintain that. And it wouldn't be proper for the town. In fact, it might be illegal in some ways for the town to actively maintain that. And so the town's going to want to determine who's buried there. If someone's buried there that would make this a historical site in some way, it might not actually be our duty, and we should reach out to the proper state entity. Now, there's also this question of a potter's cemetery. What a potter's cemetery is it's a cemetery created by counties for those who didn't have enough money to actually be buried there. Now, many of these potter's cemeteries have gone neglected, have essentially gone abandoned by the county. And so if a town finds one of those cemeteries and doesn't want to maintain it, you can say, hey, county, you took on this duty a long time ago. You should probably take it on again, or at least beautify it to some manner that it's no longer it's looking overgrown, or maybe perhaps creating liability if there are hidden dangerous elements on that property. So it might be the county's duty in that instance if the county originally created it. Now, if you look through those and you say, all right, we actually do have to maintain this cemetery. It's our duty. We're now the managers of it. If the town has actually acquired it, you can just close it and not touch it. It may not be the county's duty or the township's duty, or it can be the township's role just to close it and say, okay, we're done with this. We're going to make sure it's not dangerous, sure. But anything beyond that, any sort of extra maintenance or extra beautification, we're just not going to do. We're just going to make sure that there aren't any hidden issues. And so you can just close it, and that's perfectly okay. The next thing you can do is you can look for people who are willing to help. You can find residents who want to care for it and who want to maintain this. There are stories throughout the state of residents who are looking to go out and help and clean up these cemeteries and reorient headstones and rebuild walls. There are stories of that. And if you do have residents who want to come through and mow the property or reorient headstones, one thing I do ask is that you have them sign our volunteer agreement. And in that, that'll just help protect the town from any sort of liability concerns. And so those things are going to be important. The last thing you can do is if there's a cemetery association that has approached you, or say a funeral home, or another entity operating under 306, you can transfer that. We discussed that earlier. You'll need voter approval first, but you can transfer that. So if after all this, you say, all right, we own the cemetery, we'll take care of it for a little while. Now the question is, what do we do with it? If we're going to manage it, who's going to manage it for us? Are we allowed to repair and beautify it? What do we need to do for money regarding these things? How do we actively manage these lots? So the first one I want to discuss is employees, the most common of which is going to be a sexton. A lot of cemeteries do have sexton. Now, sexton is a very archaic term. We don't really know what that necessarily means. Oftentimes, like classically, it was a grave digger or just, again, someone who manages a cemetery. Well, being an attorney, I really do enjoy using Latin when I can. And so looking back at this term sexton, it came from a Latin term, that being sacrostanus, which directly translates to keeper of the sacred objects. This was originally a church-made position, a position made for the medieval Catholic Church, where it would be another member of the, again, the church, this person being the one who manages the cemetery or who keeps those sacred objects. So, but as time went on, this became more of a municipal or a government officer. For example, in the UK, they really took over this as a municipal position. And from the UK, that moved its way to North America as well. And this here in the US, it's not a required position. It's not a government mandated position. Instead, it's just a common cemetery position. Again, if we look back at it, it's most often thought of as a grave digger. However, that has also changed over time, just like it's no longer a official position within the church. It's also no longer just being a grave digger. This is going to be your cemetery manager. You can appoint one of your supervisors to be the cemetery sexton. If you do, please make sure that you're doing the conflicts of interest process, because this is going to be more of an employee position. So that's going to include passing a resolution by passing a unanimous resolution by all non-conflicting officers. And then whenever the officer who is conflicting, the employee officer, whenever they're receiving payment, they should submit an affidavit. So again, if you're going to have an officer do this, this is going to be an employee position. But you can also have an officer who is there kind of as an intermediary between or representative of the town board. So you do have a sexton, but if the sexton has any questions, that those questions can be directed to that supervisor, then that supervisor can bring those issues to the township board meeting. Now, other employees can also include a caretaker or a record keeper, but these can all be encompassed within that sexton position as well. Again, I do want to make sure that it's clear that the sexton position is not required. At least that title is not required. You can have a cemetery manager that accomplishes the same roles, but having a sexton position is not a required one. In our management, the other thing we can consider are the types of ornaments we allow. What types of things are we going to allow around gravestones? Are we going to allow headstones? Are we going to allow things that come up out of the ground? Issues with that is it may make mowing harder. It may make, again, general maintenance more difficult. It may also, as they degrade over time, maybe present some liability concerns if they're not properly kept up. Or are we just going to ask people to lay stones in the ground, flush with the ground? Again, helps with mowing, helps with maintenance over time. But as time goes on, you might more quickly lose those stones and then be unsure. Families may be unsure where certain graves are and where certain markers for the loved ones are. Continuing on with these ornaments, not just headstones are in question, but what kind of things are we going to allow to share memories with? Are we going to allow picture frames, flowers? Are we going to allow flower pots? Any sort of structures around these sites? What you'll want to answer that question. What is allowed? Again, going back to our earlier discussion, if you own a cemetery, you may need voter approval to create that, but it's going to be up to the town board to determine these policies. Now, if you have a cemetery that you either are loosely maintaining or you've just closed, so long as you're making sure that there aren't any concerns as it relates to falling objects or potentially dangerous conditions, you're not required to repair or beautify that cemetery. If headstones are degrading, that's not required to build up so long as it doesn't provide a dangerous condition. If you're seeing that weeds are getting out of control, or again, headstones are degrading and you have ways that you can clean that up, you can do that, but it's not required. Now, if the town doesn't want to expend their own funds to repair and beautify, you can look up or you can look for volunteers. As discussed earlier, you have volunteers throughout the state looking to assist in keeping these memories alive and keeping these memories preserved. Now, in this process of volunteers, if you can expend some funds, but not enough to then manage and consistently repair and beautify, you can supply some money to the volunteers to help ornament the cemetery. You can, again, not only can the residents there ornament if you allow for it, but the town board can also ornament the cemetery. You can bring in structures or flower pots or large plants to help beautify the area, trees. But again, this isn't going to necessarily be required by the town board to do. Now, here's one of the big questions. How do we pay for all of this? A majority of this money for the cemetery is going to come from the sale of lots. Again, this is going to be your main means, and this is going to be required to keep within the cemetery for payment. We look at money from lot sales may only be used to keep up, improve, or ornament, which is another way to say beautify the cemetery. This is found in Minnesota Statutes 365-27, subdivision 2. We see that this is required to keep this within the cemetery. Lot sales, just like are going to be restricted to cemetery use only. Now, the town can accept donations. We know that donations can be accepted by townships for any multitude of reasons, and cemeteries are just another one of those reasons to be able to accept donations. Now, with these donations, towns can, if they're not directly assigned to the cemetery, you don't have to provide it to the cemetery, but if the donator says, we're donating this to the cemetery, obviously then it goes to the cemetery fund. Now remember, when accepting donations, this does have to be done by resolution. So make sure you have your resolution prepared if you are going to be receiving donations. Now, towns can also set aside some funds in the tax levy to help pay for the cemetery. First, you can set aside $10,000 for a perpetual maintenance fund. Now, this is established by the voters at the annual meeting. If it is established, this allows the township board, so the voters turn on and off this power, and then it's the board to decide how much money is going to be put into it. It allows the township board to add additional funds to pay for the administration and the maintenance of the cemetery. Now, one major restriction here, outside of first needing voter approval, is that funds may only be added if there aren't enough funds to otherwise administer and maintain that cemetery. If from lot sales and donations, you're not receiving enough money to maintain that cemetery, say your lot sales are relatively cheap because this is looking to provide a cemetery for families in the township to continue to use, and that's not necessarily enough to administer and maintain, the board may approach the voters and say, because we're doing this, we're going to need additional funds from the property tax levy to then put this into the cemetery. And that's okay. You can do that. If in your administration of the cemetery, to keep things cheaper, to keep things more open, you can take some money, if approved by the voters, to help maintain that cemetery. Now, this is a perpetual care fund or a perpetual maintenance fund. There's also a permanent care fund. This is money that's established for the purpose of caring for, beautifying, and maintaining the cemetery. This fund cannot exceed $25,000. So this is another way you can also add funds to that cemetery. Again, if you're going to keep it cheaper on the sales end, you can take some of the property tax levy and put it towards maintaining that cemetery. Now, one of the interesting points of cemetery funds is that you can invest it. You can put it in an investment account. And I believe more on that will be discussed later this week with one of our clerk trainers, David Frame. He'll go over those issues. But you can invest cemetery funds. And the really interesting point here with the investment of cemetery funds is that the interest does not need to remain as part of that care fund, meaning that that interest comes back and can be utilized for things other than the care for and the beautification of the cemetery. So long as that principal, that original amount, is still being used after it comes out of the investments for the beautification and maintenance of that cemetery, any interest can be used for other purposes. Now, when discussing lot sales, we can see that these lots are conveyed like any other real estate, meaning that you're going to have a deed that's going to be filed with the appropriate entities. You may have an abstract, and then further, that can then be conveyed between members of the family or others as well. However, these aren't perfectly in fee interest. So when you buy a lot, that's not going to come to you like a home ownership would, because any unused lot is going to return to the township after 40 years. If, for example, when we talk about roads, we have the 25-year law and the 40-year law. This is going to be very similar to that 40-year law for township roads. So again, if a lot hasn't been used after 40 years, if an interest hasn't been recorded with the county recorder's office, the interest in that lot is going to return to the township board. Now, if you have any questions that come up about that, I would first make sure you reach out to your township attorney and make sure that there hasn't been a recording, that there is no reason to believe that, or that there is a reason to believe that this might now be a town lot again. Now, for burials, there's some very interesting things here. First of all, burying people 6 feet under is not required. Now, for attorneys, you may have to bury them 12 feet under because deep down, everyone's a good person. But for your general citizen, 6 feet under or shallower is perfectly permissible. The other big thing that has come up recently are these green burials. You can find these aren't going to be required, but the township can promote them. The township can recommend, hey, here's some biodegradable caskets you can use. The town can limit the use of burial vaults and liners. However, many cemeteries do require one or the other just because of how things work in cemetery management. Usually one or the other will be required, but by Minnesota law, neither is actually required. The town can also not require embalming. Again, this is going to be very normal that embalmings happen, but the town can not require it. However, these burials, if there's no embalming done, do need to occur within 72 hours. So if the town does allow for non-embalmed burials, it does also need to be very quick in making sure that burials do occur within the proper time frame. Now, there are some other issues specifically called out in that cemetery chapter, chapter 306. The first are going to be winter burials. During the winter, you must make a good faith effort to attempt to allow for winter burials. You must do what you can to be able to bury people during the winter, just so that we can have burials at all times of the year. The town can't just go and say, no winter burials. The town has to say, okay, we allow for that, but if there are other impeding factors, say, just like we did here in the middle of Minnesota the other day, we received a couple of inches of snow, and that's going to limit our ability to do a burial that day, then maybe that may be a reason why winter burials may not occur. But again, you have to make a good faith attempt. Now, with that being said, you can also charge more. If it's going to take more effort by the town to bury during the winter, you can charge more for that, and that's perfectly okay. Now, the other question is, or specific call out, is burials in the wrong lot. This does happen from time to time. And if the town knows that this happened, it may disinter or remove the remains in the burial casket from the lot that it was originally buried in and re-enter or put back in the remains into the proper lot. Now, if this does occur, the town must notify the people legally entitled to the bodily control before doing this. And in many cases, you'll want to notify both lot owners, and then they could agree to switch their legal lots. And so it may not be required to remove and put back the remains into the proper site. But if you do, if you do, again, you will have to notify those beforehand. Now, for just the last part that I want to touch on is there are penalties for messing around with cemeteries. There are misdemeanors, gross misdemeanors, and felonies. Misdemeanors carry up to 90 days in jail and $1,000 fine. Gross misdemeanors, I believe, provide up to either 180 or about a year in jail, 180 days or about 365 days, and up to a $3,000 fine. And then felonies are what are detailed in statute. All these can occur in cemeteries. So when we look at misdemeanors, some things that could occur is trespassing on cemetery grounds. You can, if you enter cemetery grounds before or after posted hours, or hours that the cemetery is just closed, that is trespassing, and that's a misdemeanor. And you're that if you do find that happening, you can always reach out to your county sheriff and ask him to provide citations to the trespassers. Now, another point here that's not listed, but there's mandatory reporting by the sexton. If the sexton doesn't report, there may be issues if he finds that remains are removed and he, again, doesn't report that. Now, there are gross misdemeanors for just generally defacement, injury, or destruction of historical or archaeological data belonging to the state. This means if there's tampering of remains, that will be first a gross misdemeanor, and secondly, we see below a felony as well. But generally speaking, removal of a tombstone, monument, or structure is going to lead to a gross misdemeanor. Removing of fence, railing, and other protection or ornaments is also going to be a gross misdemeanor. And then the other point here is discharging a firearm on cemetery grounds will also lead to that gross misdemeanor. And lastly, there are felonies. Like I said earlier, if it's someone else's duty to maintain the cemetery, like the county or the Veterans Association or the DNR, if you go in and start maintaining that cemetery, you may actually be in concern of a felony. And so you'll want to ensure that what's going on there isn't someone else's duty to care for it. So those are the main penalties when it comes to cemeteries. So in conclusion, we want to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Does the town want the cemetery? If not, who owns that cemetery? The town wants to care for it, but doesn't want to own it. Is it owned by someone else? Is it a neglected cemetery? And if the township owns a cemetery, what kind of considerations do you need to take? When do we bury folks? How deep do we bury them? What kind of procedures do we allow them to take? How do we pay for the cemetery? Are we going to try to fund it exclusively through lot sales and donations? Or are we going to receive some assistance from the property tax levy? What kind of employees are we going to hire? Are we going to hire one sexton to ensure that all of the proper procedures are taken? Or are we going to have a couple of employees, a record keeper, a grave digger, and then have a supervisor just be the intermediary between those individuals and the township board? Again, if you have, with that being said, are there any questions? I saw a couple in the chat and the Q&A. And so let's walk through those now. There we go. So I will start here, Paul. So the question is Indian Mound cemetery. What's the status as a cemetery and how do we treat it? So that is probably going to be a state entity that's in charge of that. So you may want to reach out to the DNR and ask them, okay, here is a Indian mound. What do we do? We're not fully aware that we should touch this. There's a town that's raised their hand, so Jenkins, go ahead.
Jenkins Township?
Yeah, go ahead.
Our cemetery was platted in 1904, and we have a host of burial plots that have not been used in probably 100 years or more.
Mhm.
Now, with your 40-year rule, does that automatically go back to us, or is there a procedure we have to follow, or what would be the procedure?
So that would probably automatically go back to you. You'll want to check if there's been any recordings within the last 40 years, although there haven't been any burials. You'll do want to check if there are, again, any recordings. And so essentially, is there any activity within the last 40 years? And if there is, then that will remain with the lot owners. But if not, that should probably come back, or there's a strong likelihood that that would come back to the township.
It used to be you had to post it. The old statute said you had to notify the owner, which obviously you can't after 100 years, and then post it in the legal newspaper. Does that still hold up?
Let me double check here.
And the requirement used to be 60 years, and now I see that you said it was 40 years now.
Where did I set that? Here it is. So this is citing Minnesota statutes 365.27. And in subdivision 3 of that statute, it says if a lot is sold or not used, ownership reverts to the town 40 years after the sale or 40 years after the most recent recording with the county recorder of a notice of kind described in section 541.023 or another document that relates to ownership, whichever is the latest. The town may take legal action the same way as any other person to clarify the ownership or to assure the marketability of the lot. So you'll want to take some action to notify the owner and see if they've taken some interest. But it is 40 years and there aren't necessarily any requirements outside of taking the proper actions to take back that lot after 40 years of non-notice with the county recorder.
Carl, Mike Dubay, Jenkins Township Chair, just a little clarification. This is a cemetery that we acquired years and years ago from private family, and they sold 6 at a time, and that's the problem we run into, because they had 6, but maybe only 2 would want to be occupied, or 3 would be occupied. The other ones are buried, we don't know, some other place, and never redeemed that. And that's what we're running with. So we got a few vacant spots because of that. Now, since we're thinking about expanding it because we have more room, expanding a new section where we're only going to allow, one deed for one person, as opposed to buying 6 overall lots. Do you see any situation there that we could acquire those lots that were sold in the units of 6?
Again, probably if there hasn't been any sort of record or notice in the last 40 years that those lot owners are still hoping to maintain ownership, you can take the proper legal steps to then take ownership back of that lot to essentially assure its marketability, because like you said, right now they're unused and will probably be considered or continue as unused for the next who knows how long. And so again, as long as you make sure that you're taking the proper legal steps. And for that, you might want to speak with your township attorney. Then you should be able to take back those lots.
Thank you.
Mhm. There's another question here about the green burial option at the township cemetery and if this needs to be voted on by the public. The answer is no. So this is going to come down to that management side of things. In that management side, the green burial option will be to the township board's discretion. Obviously, at the annual meeting, you can get voter recommendation if you would like that and see what they would prefer, but by no means is that required. Steve asks if it's ever possible to fully eliminate a cemetery. That's going to probably be no. You can close it, you can leave it, but dissolution is going to be difficult because of the remains there. And so because there are remains in the cemetery, it probably is not possible to fully ever eliminate a cemetery. So if it comes to the town and the town isn't able to find someone to assist in maintenance of that, or who would like to receive a transfer, that's probably going to remain with the township, even if it is closed. Paul asks, is there an official process to verify the status of a cemetery association to know that they still exist? No, there unfortunately is not an official process. The steps I detailed earlier, so that's going to be starting with reaching out to see if someone is still there in general, checking around to see who maintained that, and then if that person is still around, seeing if they are still taking active steps, or if there's an organization there with that are taking active steps. If nothing there, you can see if there is ever a formal filing with the Secretary of State's office. Again, that might not lead to, or that might lead to a lot of dead ends, as a lot of cemetery associations are formed informally. And then lastly, you can check with the State Association of Cemeteries, and the State Association of Cemeteries may have some answers. And if they don't, and if you're not ever able to find evidence of dissolution, then you may just look at that as a neglected cemetery rather than abandoned cemetery that would allow the town to acquire ownership of. Is a township cemetery limited to only township residents? Generally speaking, no. The towns tend to have a duty where it needs to be, as a government entity, where it needs to allow all types of people in that cemetery. In some towns, that limitation might look like to just town residents, but that limitation may be too restrictive. However, if they are a resident of the township, one thing you could do is you could reduce their lot price compared to those who are non-residents of the township or non-residents of the county. And so if that is the case, again, you may increase those lot prices for those who aren't township residents, but you shouldn't restrict burials in the cemetery to only town residents. So question here, if we can rewatch the meeting later, if part of the meeting was missed due to a technical problem. Yes, there will be recordings of the meeting afterward. Any other questions? Well, again, I want to thank you all for listening to me discuss cemeteries. I know that it can be a dry topic sometimes, but we're all looking to avoid making that grave mistake. And so, again, I thank you for listening.